don't sit home and read paleontology journals. At least I assume you don't. Well, there might be one of two or two of you out there that might. The vast majority of taxonomic orders and families alive today are found in the fossil record without transitional forms. Our fossil museums, ladies and gentlemen, have 250,000 fossil species in them. But one thing we don't have is macroevolutionary intermediate forms. The missing link is still missing. So, Dr. Kurt Wise, who, as far as I know, the only other paleontologist out there that's a creationist, Harvard graduate, PhD, has done a test on this, and this comes from the Answers Journal. Who gets that? You guys, some of you guys get that? It's outstanding. I highly recommend it. It has some top-notch articles in there. And Dr. Wise pointed out that there's a number of studies that show the completeness of the fossil record, and I'll give some examples. One of them is European mammals. In one of these particular studies, Bjorn Curtin determined that 88% of the mammal species living in Europe today are also present in the fossil record in Europe. 88%. We can find the exact same species as fossils. And look at this, even more dramatic. 99% are present in the fossil record somewhere on Earth. So guess which model that fits better? Does that fit a macroevolutionary model where the evolutionists are always saying, oh, well, we just haven't found enough fossils? That was Darwin's excuse more than 150 years ago. We'll find them. They're out there. The intermediates are out there. We'll find them. We just haven't dug up enough fossils. Okay, well, that's not what this study shows. So somebody might think, oh, well, that's an aberration. One little teeny study based on European fossils. Come on, you're making too much out of that. Okay. Good point. Glad you made it. So let's go to another example then. Dr. James Valentine, who is an evolutionist, by the way, oh, he's not a creationist, found that 76.8% of the marine mollusks, those are, shellfish, example is shellfish, species currently living along the Southern California and Baja California coasts are also found in the fossil record. Okay, I realize I only gave 2 examples, but there are more. I just don't want to bore you where you fall asleep and miss the rest of the talk. Conclusion, the fossil record is reasonably complete, as predicted, far better by the creationists than the evolutionists want to admit. If then the fossil record is reasonably complete, let's just say it's 75%, or maybe more than that, 80%. We should find some of these intermediate forms, and we don't. Now, that's not to say there's not candidates that pop up consistently. There's usually 4 or 5 new ones per year. Should be 4 or 5 million new ones, because if there were intermediate forms, there'd be more intermediate forms than non-intermediate forms, and there'd be all kinds of taxonomic wars on how we classify this fossil or that fossil. Instead of little teeny skirmishes, worrying about one particular dinosaur that may or may not be, feathered. So the truth of the matter is, we do not have these kinds of organisms. And usually when they appear, usually when there's one that's, pointed out, oh, creationists, you guys say we don't find any intermediate forms, here's one. Then within a few years, usually those are downgraded and they turn out to be wrong. I'll give some examples of that tonight with the human fossil record. So fossils tend to be found in catastrophic deposits. Now this is a prediction. I realize it's kind of, post-fact, but nonetheless, if we go all the way back to the Bible, God's Word, and look in Genesis 6 through 9, where we see there was this catastrophic worldwide event that destroyed the world that then was, we should find catastrophic deposits of billions of organisms, many, many different kinds of species that were not just loosely buried, but buried en masse catastrophically. And that is exactly what we find. Most organisms that we find died violent deaths. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, for example, clams. Most of the clams that we find, there are exceptions, they tend to have closed shells. They tend to have closed shells. And clams, when they're under stress, will do that. Whereas normally, if they just die, the pieces tend to break apart and float away and so forth. But we tend to find, you can just go right up to Old Topanga Canyon here in Southern California, and you will find billions of these clams fossilized with the shells closed. That's evidence they were deposited catastrophically under duress and stress. Dinosaurs is another good example of that. By the way, I'm only citing a few examples of each of these. These are trends, though, where we could cite many more if we needed to, but for time I'm only citing one or two examples. Dinosaurs. Most show a lack of scavengers. They don't show having been preyed on because they were deposited quickly, catastrophically. If you go to Dinosaur National Monument, you'll see that the limb bones are deposited directionally. Okay? Now, Dinosaur National Monument's an interesting case because what they did there is they built a museum around a particular quarry that had been worked. And for me, you know, being a paleontologist, I'm a kid in a candy store, so I went out there with my best friend. He distracted the ranger while I climbed up onto the side of the hill, and actually, you know, I had to touch those dinosaur bones. And, you know, they're all laminated. You can't hurt them. But it was like, for me, it was like being a little kid, you know. He talked to the ranger while I ran up there, and I had to touch him. It was really fun. About 95% of animal fossils are marine invertebrates. Most are fish. And terrestrial remains turn out to be mostly plants. But here's what's so interesting. The continents are completely covered over by marine fossils. That's rather odd, isn't it? They're covered over by marine fossils. What does that tell you? There must have been some catastrophic event that covered them that way. By the way, you can find a lot of this information here in John Morris's new book on the fossil record. So animals are found also in mixed habitats. That's very odd. For example, saltwater fish are found with freshwater crocodiles, and there's many other examples like that. I'm just citing one, again, for lack of time. Massive fossil graveyards. This is not the exception. It is the rule. These argue for universal deposition at the time of a catastrophic flood. Examples: Dinosaur National Monument, we find at least 16 different species deposited, guess what, in water-deposited sediments and directionally oriented. Petrified Forest, Arizona, where I had the privilege of arguing for catastrophism on the Discovery Channel, and what you will find there also, directionally oriented logs. Millions of them. The deposits go down 300 feet in the north end of the park. All the logs directionally oriented, no root systems, no branches, and no tops of the trees. Why? Because they were transported long distance and deposited. That argues for catastrophism. This is the norm, not the exception. Implications of catastrophic events. Catastrophic deposits of more marine fossils are found almost exclusively on the continents. This argues for universal flood. If the geological time scale, I say if, the geological time scale, geologic column, whatever you want to call it, does not show macroevolution, and it does not, in my opinion, then what does it actually show? It's in every textbook. It's there as representing different time periods, very factual. Well, Andrew Snelling has looked at this for many years, and he sees three main points. Fossils, particularly in the Paleozoic, that's the oldest of the time periods. Paleo means ancient, zoic means period, are organisms that lived in marine environments. Now hang in there, this is very important. Fossils that lived in the Mesozoic are a mixture of organisms from marine and terrestrial, and fossils that lived in the Cenozoic, which means recent time, are almost all terrestrial environments. That's land type of environments. The conclusion is this data argues for environmental distribution of life from a catastrophic flood. It's deposited environmentally. Where would you tend to get the oldest, quickest organisms deposited first? On the bottom of the oceans, as the turbidity currents, as they're called,